very exciting, thank you, Esther, for what is a very exciting event for us as Impunity Watch and the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, CSVR, as we launch our policy brief on a very central issue on youth participation in transitional justice processes. My name is Nyari Pariola. I'm an advocacy specialist with CSVR, and I'll be your host for today. I would like to start off by observing protocol and welcoming representatives of the African Union here present, particularly Mr. John Ikubaje. Thank you, sir, for your presence here with us today. I would also like to welcome all distinguished guests in our midst and our panelists for the day, Mr. Usani Odoom, and our youth representative and who was also a research participant, Ms. Lydie Akonkwa. I'd like to welcome our esteemed colleagues from Impunity Watch, with whom we've partnered to make this policy brief a reality through a research and dialogue project that we partnered on. I would also like to welcome our local partners in South Sudan, in Mali, in DRC, in Burundi, who made this work possible and lend support on the ground. I want to welcome all our colleagues in civil society. I particularly want to welcome all the African youth here present, as you are really the main delegates and target beneficiaries of this policy brief. CSVR colleagues, all participants here present, I welcome you all protocols duly observed. So our program for today is very tight and very short. We're going to start off with introductory remarks and a welcome from Ms. Malise Staples, the Executive Director of Impunity Watch. And then from there, we're going to go into the actual launch of the policy brief. We'll have two presenters for that. The first one will be Mr. Gentil Kasongo, who was one of the lead researchers on the project, and he'll be presenting on the background of the research and methodology. And then after that, we'll have Mr. Steven Rebello from CSVR, who was the lead author of the policy brief itself, and he'll be presenting on research findings and recommendations. We will then have panel interventions from our panelists, from our distinguished guests who are panelists today, and they are experts in the fields of transitional justice, and they will be engaging with the critical issues that are raised in the policy brief and really lend their expertise in the analysis of these findings. After that, we'll then now open up the floor for all participants to engage in a discussion. You can ask questions of the presenters or the panelists, but I also really want to encourage all participants to, particularly the youth, please share your experiences, your challenges, any obstacles that perhaps you have faced personally, or that you believe that youth face in participating in transitional justice processes. And I really hope that one of the key things that we can do in our main discussion forum is that we'll flesh out the recommendations that we can give to the African Union, to regional bodies and mechanisms, and especially to our national governments on how they can incorporate and amplify youth voices more in transitional justice processes. So without any further ado, allow me to please introduce Ms. Malise Staples and then ask her to do the introductory remarks. Please note that we are also streaming live on Facebook. So Ms. Malise Staples is the founder and executive director of Impunity Watch. As director, she has been deeply involved in research and policy work related to the fields of human rights, transitional justice, impunity reduction, and strengthening the role of civil society, and particularly victims and affected communities in countries such as Guatemala and Honduras, Burundi, the Great Lakes region, the Western Balkans, and Cambodia. Her educational background is in Latin American studies. Ms. Malise, the floor is yours. I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Nyari, for this very kind introduction, and good morning to you all. Here I'm in the Netherlands, and there's a huge hailstorm now breaking out, and I'm sure in Africa the weather is a little bit better, but just so you understand a little bit where I'm sitting. So if there's noise, it's the hailstorm going on here. On behalf of Impunity Watch and CSVR, it's my great pleasure to give you all a very warm welcome to this exciting event. As you know, this event focuses on a very important topic, which is youth participation in transitional justice policymaking in Africa. And it is a very important topic because Africa is, of course, a continent where there is a very young population. 19 out of 20 countries with the youngest population in the world are actually situated in Africa. But even I think more important is the fact that youth tend to be those who are most affected by conflict and violence. So not involving youth in transitional justice policymaking means we risk such processes really don't meaningfully respond to the real needs of youth, and that their civic participation of youth and the role they can play in peace building and development also gets severely undermined. When I look here, I must say that I'm really pleased to see that we have such a diverse audience for this event participating. I mean, we have African Union officials, we have civil society actors from all over the continent participating, we have members of the diplomatic community, academics, citizens, youth from all over the country. And I think that really shows that there is a broad interest in the topic, which is very important, and perhaps also a consensus that we share that really more needs to be done to promote youth participation in transitional justice as a priority. So Nyari already mentioned that this event marks also the launch of a joint policy brief that was researched and written between Impunity Watch and CSVR. About the topic that we're discussing today, on the topic of inclusion in transitional justice policymaking. And this policy paper, but also the event that we're having today, are first outcomes of a new strategic partnership that we have between CSVR and Impunity Watch, a very exciting partnership, I might add. And both our organizations, CSVR and Impunity Watch, we share the belief that if we want transitional justice policy to be better focused on and be more meaningful to affected communities and to victims, it's absolutely crucial that we enhance community voices in policymaking circles. In the past, we've already had more ad hoc collaborations with CSVR on this particular issue. But last year we felt, that it would be a good idea for us to strengthen that partnership and work more closely together in order, by working together, to enhance the reach of our work, but also the impact of what we want to achieve. And I must say, that over this time that we've been more closely working together, it has been really inspiring. It has been a learning experience. We've learned a lot from working with CSVR. Yeah, I really look forward for us to deepen our collaboration towards the future. So the policy brief that we are discussing and launching today, it's based on a research that we conducted last year, actually, in 4 countries in Africa. We did it in Burundi, DRC, Mali, and South Sudan. And the idea for this research was, that we would shift the focus from policy experts that are normally engaged in this research to really engaging the views and perspectives of youth and youth activists, in which we took special care to involve also the voice and the participation of young women. So we interviewed 300 youth over this period, and we asked them for their views pertaining to 3 issues, actually. One on youth participation in policymaking, another on mental health and psychosocial support approaches, and the third one on violent masculinities. So the policy brief we're launching today is the first one, and we really hope that in the upcoming period we'll also launch and be able to share with you the 2 other policy briefs on MHPSS and on violent masculinities. So the results of the policy brief that we're discussing today will be presented to you shortly by my very esteemed colleagues, Gentil Kasongo and Steven Rebello. But what I would just like to stress here is that I'm truly impressed with the invaluable inputs youth have to share on a transitional justice policymaking. I mean, if you look at the results, there's 3 issues that really are striking. First of all, there's no one better placed than the youth themselves to tell us in what way they're affected by violence, by conflicts, and the very different ways how this affects them. Secondly, I was really impressed to see, the innovative ideas coming from youth, how policy making can be improved so that it really addresses their needs and priorities. And thirdly, and I think this is also key that we understand this better, they highlighted to us the many obstacles and structures that are in place that really hamper their voice to be heard in these policy making spheres, and which also inhibit their stronger political agency in transitional justice policy making processes. And this is really a pity because youth also, they flag to us that they are young, they have huge energy, they would love to be involved more actively in transitional justice policy making processes, even as transitional justice ambassadors. So it points to, what we can win if we really more strategically invest in youth. In the report, there is a quote that really struck me, and I think it really pinpoints down, what we should be focusing on, what's really the issue of what we should be discussing here in this event as well. It's a quote from a participant of Mali, actually. And this person said, if everyone says we, the youth, are the future of the country, then why do we stand aside from transitional justice processes? And this is a key question, I think, we would really like to explore and resolve. So what is very positive, that we should also highlight here is that over the past decades, transitional justice frameworks have increasingly recognized the importance of putting affected communities and victims at the center of transitional justice policies. And also I want to highlight that the African Union Mom needs to perhaps silence the microphone, but that also the African Union Transitional Justice Framework is really unique in that sense. I mean, it's the only transitional justice framework I know that has a focus on youth as one of its foundational pillars. And I think, this is an example also to all other policy frameworks in the world. However, what we also see is that what is on paper doesn't automatically translate into practice. And there's still a huge gap between what is in the transitional justice policy frameworks and what we see happening in the different African Union member states in the transitional justice programs on the ground. And still we find that these transitional justice programs are often very top-down, they're technical, they're exclusive, and only lip service is being paid to the participation of youth. So just to say that I think, the event that we're having now is timely. I think a focus on youth is really essential. And as the participants have told us in the research, is that by focusing on the youth, we're also really investing in the future and in creating more peaceful societies. So to discuss these topics, I'm happy, to say that we have a really distinguished and extremely well qualified panel to discuss these issues with us, and they will share our perspectives with us. And Nyari already mentioned them, but let me just welcome one more, Mr. John Ikubaje. We're very happy to have you here. Mr. John Ikubaje is a senior political officer within the African Commission's Department on Political Affairs, Peace and Security. And we know he has played a very central role on the transitional justice work and policy making within the African Union. So we'll be very delighted to hear about his perspectives on this topic. Secondly, we have Mr. Usani Odoom. He is the project officer in charge of the African Youth for Transitional Justice Project. And this is a project that has as its goal to strengthen youth participation within the transitional justice programs of the different African Union member states. So it will be really interesting to hear more about what is being done within this project, and also perhaps some of the lessons that are coming out of that project that could be useful for us. And finally, and definitely last but not least, is Miss Lydie Akonkwa. She is from the DRC, and she was one of the participants in our research and the roundtable we had in the DRC. And I'm really delighted that she's here because it's so important that we listen to some of the lived experience of the participants on the ground. So a very warm welcome to all of you. As I said, we have a very distinguished a panel that has huge expertise. And I think, together they can really offer some key insights towards the way forward, and I hope some fresh ideas. And I hope this event is not just the one-off in which we discuss this, but that we can really think together how to move forward on this very important topic. So without further ado, Nyari, if that's okay, I'd like to hand over to you one more time. A big welcome to all of you, and I wish you all a very fruitful event. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Malise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malise, for that very warm welcome and introductory remarks. I think, just to say thank you so much. In fact, I'm sorry, Malise, before I thank you, I would just like to let everyone know, and pardon me for forgetting this, that there is interpretation, actually. We have French interpretation. So bonjour tout le monde, to all our French colleagues. Welcome. Sorry that I did not mention this. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a round ball with interpretation there. So we have simultaneous interpretation available. I hope that will be useful. Thank you. So yes, Malise, thank you so much for those for that warm welcome. And I think really just for emphasizing how important this issue is, and especially given that the youngest population, as you showed, is in Africa. And I think I just want to thank you also for acknowledging that it is the youth that are most affected by conflict and violence, and that there's no one better placed to speak for youth than the youth themselves. And I think really this is why we're here, to advocate for this issue, but to see how we can make this to become a reality. And yes, thank you also just for highlighting the uniqueness of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which has inclusion of youth as its foundational pillar, as you say. And this really is unique and very responsive to the lived realities of African people on the ground. I must confess, I love the AUTJP with our 11 pillars and inclusion of youth. So I hope that, if anyone doubted how important this issue is, that you are now convinced that the next hour will be time well spent as we discuss this very important issue. So once again, without much further ado, let me introduce our presenters who will be launching the policy brief, as I said earlier. So the next speaker will be Mr. Gentil Kasongo, who is a research consultant and transitional justice practitioner from DRC, with about 10 years of experience working on human rights, transitional justice, and conflict transformation issues in the Great Lakes region. He is currently based in Bujumbura, Burundi, with the regional office of Impunity Watch. Prior to joining Impunity Watch, he worked as a consultant for Sonke Gender Justice and Adonai Consulting. He holds a master's in human rights law from the University of Cape Town and a law degree from the University of Goma. Mr. Gentil Kasongo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nyari. Can you hear me all?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. My camera is not very good. I'm going to switch it off. And also my colleague, Steven, is going to share with us his screen for our co-presentation. Our presentation has two parts. The first part is like a background in methodology aspect, and then Steven is going to share a little bit also about the results and the recommendations of the policy brief. So I'm going to share briefly about the background. My esteemed colleague, our director, Malise, has already said something about the background of the project and the research itself. But I would say that in terms of background, although the importance of youth inclusion has been formally recognized as a key principle in developing appropriate and responsive TJ processes, What this means in practice remains unclear, actually. How can youth be included in such processes? What are the obstacles to their involvement? And what would a more youth-responsive transitional justice agenda look like? So to address these questions, Impunity Watch and CSVR, as Marlies has already said, have partnered on a research and dialogue project that aims to bridge the gap between communities, particularly young people, and continental policymakers. So the research seeks to shift the focus from policy experts' inputs to engaging the views of youth and youth activists and understanding their experiences and perspectives. So the project focused on 3 core issues of transitional justice policy making, namely the participation of African youth, especially young women, in policy making. Secondly, gender and masculinities. And thirdly, mental health or trauma healing and psychosocial support. So the policy brief being launched today focuses on the first core issue, participation of African youth, especially young women in policy making, and shares the results of focus group discussions and individual interviews held with youth and key informants in 4 countries, like Marlies has already mentioned: Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and South Sudan. So in terms of methodology, I would say briefly that a total of 132 youth participated in focus group discussion between October and December 2021. This included a relatively equal distribution of youth voices from the 4 countries. The young people who participated in the discussions were also diverse in terms of their locations, educational outcomes, and levels of civic engagement. The questions included in the focus group discussions and interview guides focused on participants' understanding of the concepts of policy, participation, and transitional justice. It's also focused, the question is also focused on the perceptions of participation in national policy making, awareness of the African Union transitional justice policy, as well as perceptions of youth participation in TJ policy making in their respective countries. So the results shared in the policy brief represent an integrated presentation of the key themes that emerged from these discussion points. So I hand over to my colleague, Steven, to share with you briefly about the research results and the recommendations. Over to you, Steven.
Gentil, I think before Steve speaks, let me just introduce him as well.
Yes, please, go ahead.
No problem. I think firstly also, I just want to say thank you for, I think you've raised the critical questions that really encapsulate why we're here today and the issues that I hope the participants will engage in during the plenary session, you know, on how do we bridge that gap, right, between policymakers and the youth. And to just break that down further, he was asking, how can youth be included in policy processes? What are the obstacles to their involvement? And what can a more youth-responsive transitional justice agenda look like? So Steve is now here. He's going to tell us what the research findings are and what the youth in the 4 countries that we did the research in, what did they have to say about this? Steve Rebello, as I said, was the lead author of the policy brief. He's a senior researcher at CSVR, as well as a counseling psychologist based in Johannesburg. His key research interests include youth economic inclusion, particularly action research, as well as the pathways between experiences of inequality, relative deprivation, and violence. Steve, over to you. Thank you.
Gentil, for the introduction into the research and for providing a background. I'm going to try and stop my video just so there's hopefully less data needing to be transferred. So in terms of the results, one of the first themes that we had was linked to young people or youth's views on policy and policy making. And I think a lot of the time we make assumptions that young people lack awareness of what these concepts mean and, you know, opportunities to participate. And what we find in the research is that actually many young people have a good sense of what the term policy means. And many young people, which were about 132, I think, that were included in this part of the research, they recognize that policies are developed and are relevant for different spaces. So not just national policies, but you have policies in the workplace, or you have policies in schools, and even informal policies in the home. But there's still the sense of a very top-down approach to policy development. That's where we might have public officials, public servants, or advisors who develop policies for different groups of citizens, and policies are not being developed with young people or different affected groups. And you can see the quotes there underneath is just reflecting that understanding of how policies are developed for different spaces. In terms of youth participation, youth understood participation as the different ways that people can be involved in their communities or be involved in the different aspects of local and national development or governance. One of the kind of sub-themes that's always interesting for me is the competing narratives or views of youth and their participation in policy making or governance. The first competing narrative is this idea or this problematizing narrative of youth, where youth are seen as dangerous, lazy, dependent, or entitled. So the sense that youth are disinterested, they don't really want to participate. And I think, you know, the competing narrative is the reality actually that young people are experiencing. And that's what this policy brief highlights, that there are multiple obstacles and barriers that actually, I think, lead to youth being disillusioned with some of these formal spaces or opportunities to participate. And we see some of that disillusionment coming up, you know, in the form of protests or the lack of participation. You can see the quotes at the bottom, a young person from Mali who said, young people think it is high time that they themselves stood up and show that they want to participate, since now most young people only like easy money. And for me, that's an example of this problematizing or pathologizing narrative, this idea that young people are lazy. We just want the easy money. But the reality is that more than 80% of young Africans are involved in the informal sector and involved in micro enterprises and, you know, entrepreneurship. So obviously these ideas are not reflecting the reality of many young Africans. Another obviously sub-theme was the barriers to participation that young people face. And this is not just in TJ, but more generally. And one of the first barriers is the tokenistic inclusion. So when young people are included, it's more just because it's a tick box or something that needs to be done. And it's not really a very meaningful type of inclusion. I think the second barrier is that we need to recognize that a lot of these policy spaces they're not vacuums. There's a lot going on in these spaces, and there are some privileges that are associated with the spaces as well. So that's opportunities to develop social capital, to develop networks. They're politically contested as well. And there is economic value to some of these opportunities as well. These spaces also try and maintain the status quo. So that could be, politically the status quo, or even a gendered kind of status quo. And exclusion is also based on identifying factors. So for example, you can see one of the quotes here where young women are excluded just on the basis of being women. This idea that women can't travel by themselves, they need their husband's permission, or they need to be home before the sun sets. And if they do find themselves in these spaces, then unfortunately they will be, sexually harassed, or will not be, taken seriously in these spaces. Another sub-theme is that there's a general lack of awareness of the concept of TJ. And so many of the participants did not really know what transitional justice is, though there was a minority that did understand processes like truth commissions, memorialization. So there was some understanding of it. But there's also a lack of awareness around the African Union's transitional justice policy. And I think almost all the participants agreed for the call in the AU-TJP for youth to be included in all aspects of transitional justice. But as you can see in the quote here at the very bottom, is that young people are concerned about whether this policy will be implemented or whether it will be turned into a reality. I think there's still this sense of that tokenism, young people just being there to sign an attendance register, or just be in the room. A next theme that we were looking at is young people's views on TJ and opportunities for participation in TJ policymaking. And young people pointed to a lot of benefits of their inclusion in transitional justice policymaking. And the first that has been mentioned is that youth make up the largest percentage of most populations across the continent. And there are some similarities and differences across generations. So what young people have been experiencing is different to previous generations. For example, the quote on the bottom right shows how previous generations might have been able to complete their education, but the current generation of young people, because of war and conflict, they weren't able to attend schools, they weren't able to complete the education. And, we can just imagine how that prevents them from moving forward in their lives, from maybe finding employment. So we can see how, what's been happening over time affects different generations. And there's obviously another point that was mentioned is the consequences of youth exclusion. And generally young people also spoke about how they're more likely to be exploited than included. And the sense that, the old men are the ones who are invited to participate and the ones who are taken seriously. And then young people are the foot soldiers. They're sent out to do the dirty work, to carry out violence. And we've seen that in many countries, and in Zimbabwe, it's been well documented as well. In terms of youth priorities, we also need to see that transitional justice, I think, needs to recognize the diverse interests and needs of young people. A lot of the time, TJ has been criticized as having a certain approach or certain processes, but the young people included in this research mentioned obviously their educational needs, economic, psychological, and social needs, and how TJ needs to recognize the different ways that conflict and war has affected, the different areas of their lives. Coming to my last slide, I think one of the first recommendations that comes from the policy brief is that we need to challenge discourses and norms that perpetuate youth exclusion. So this is the idea that young people are young and ignorant and they don't really know much about life, and therefore we shouldn't really listen to them. And we really need to say, well, how do we change that? How do we show that young people actually have invaluable lived experiences and knowledge. The second is we need to address gendered obstacles to participation in TJ policy processes. So again, how do we make sure that this opportunities to participate are equally available for people of different gender identities? So I guess not just male and female, but people who also identify from different genders as well. And these spaces are still dominated by men. So we need to say, how do we change that? We need to publicize and popularize TJ and AUTJP. So that could be, maybe using social media, different digital platforms, local radio, TV, newspapers. We need to find out what are the different ways that young people access information, and to try and use those platforms to create an awareness around TJ. We also need to establish structures from local to national levels to facilitate youth participation in TJ policy processes. We can see that many successful political parties are very good at mobilizing from a local to a national level. So why can't they do the same when it comes to mobilizing young people to be part of TJ processes? So that's really what we need to do as well. We need to ensure greater representation of youth in decision-making structures. And so again, I think that's not just in TJ, but I think young people want to see parliaments and governments and different structures being a bit more reflective of, the demographics of their countries. We also need to recognize the multiple needs and perspectives of youth, which we've pointed to already. The second last point is skills development, transfers, and mentorship. So that's part of TJ is how do we develop young people's capacity to understand TJ and to maybe understand some of the more technical aspects of transitional justice. How do we develop that capacity? And the last point is around how do we ensure accountability for policy implementation? So this is not just for TJ, but I guess for other national policies as well, is how do we ensure that governments will implement these policies? From my end, that's the last of my points. Thanks so much, Nyari.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for sharing what I think are really fascinating findings that the research made, and just hearing the voices of youth on this issue, and also sharing what I think are very key and very important recommendations that I hope we can really take a hold of. I'm glad to see that the research, challenges the damaging narratives about youth. And I want to encourage participants in the plenary, let's really highlight the barriers that exist to youth participation, so we can undo these harmful narratives that seek to perpetuate our exclusion and diminish our value in this process. I was also glad to see that the research had a gendered lens to it, and that you highlighted the additional challenges that young women in particular face in these spaces as well, apart from just the challenges that youth face as a whole. And thank you also for highlighting that there is a need to popularize the AUTJP. And I hope, some of the youth activists in our midst are seeing an opportunity here for how we can advance a more youth inclusive TJ agenda. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Gentil. We will now turn to the interventions by our distinguished panelists. And for this, we will start with a contribution from Mr. John Ikubaje. Malise, thank you so much for doing the introductory sort of an overview of introducing him. I'm now just going to do a more extensive introduction, just so people know who he is and what work he's been doing. So Mr. John Ikubaje is a senior political officer in the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security at the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He's a fellow of the United Nations Regional Human Rights System. He holds a bachelor and master's degrees in political science from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and an MA in governance and development from the Institute of Development Studies the University of Sussex in Brighton, United Kingdom. He supervises human rights and transitional justice within the Governance and Conflict Prevention Directorate of the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security. Mr. Ikubaje has written extensively and made several presentations within and beyond the African continent on issues of democratic and good governance, human rights, and transitional justice. He is the author of The African Union and the Fight Against Corruption, a continental development architecture, amongst others. Mr. Ikubaje, it really is a great honor to have you in our midst today. I hand the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Really appreciate it. Let me start on this note by thanking the organizers of this very important meeting, particularly Impunity Watch and our long-standing partner, CSVR, for inviting the African Union Commission to be part of this discussion. Let me indicate that I have keenly read the policy brief from page to page, and I have gone through it seriously, and it's very, very instructive in the sense that it outlines the opportunities and challenges for youth participation in transitional justice policy and processes, particularly in the 4 affected states that was researched. Quickly, because of time, let me just first start this way. I have just few points. And the first point that I want to emphasize here is that popular participation in policy processes is a foundation for a legitimate governance, a viable mechanism for sustaining peace and security, and also for sustainable development. And this is why, as many of us that are interested in transitional justice, I believe you are familiar and you are also journeying along with the United Nations Human Rights Council. And you must have seen the recent report that was released on transitional justice, titled Human Rights and Transitional Justice. That report, which is still had just been released, emphasized the significance of inclusions of stakeholders in transitional justice as a cardinal yardstick for sustainable peace and development across the globe. And so the issues that we are discussing now, this particular policy brief, is also one of the issues that the Human Rights Council is looking at critically under the report that has just been released on human rights and transitional justice across the world. So it is very important that youth are involved in TJ processes. And the African Union believes that popular participation in policy processes across board is critical to the realization of the goals and objectives of the African Union, and also the Agenda 2063 and its aspiration, which in a nutshell is the African that we want. So African Union believes that without the participation of critical stakeholders, particularly the youth, the women, and other marginalized groups, we can't have, the type of African that we want. And the Agenda 2063, which is the African Union long-term development agenda, will be, a futility effort in futility without accomplishing what we want. And that is the reason why the African Union has adopted several initiatives, particularly normative instruments on popular participation. And I will just mention briefly some of these few things before I go to other points. One, there is the African Charter on Popular Participation in Development and Transformation, adopted in 1990. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Charter on Democracy, Election and Governance, AU Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, just to mention but a few. These are critical, important governance instruments, which we refer to as the AU share value. If you look at all these instruments, there are provisions for stakeholder participation in policy processes and also in development agenda in our member state. But it is very important for us to emphasize that the AU, while AU facilitate the development of policy and the development initiative, implementations take place at the local level. Now, inclusivity and also meaningful participation are critical principles in all the African Union policy instruments. And it is very important that youth are also involved. Now, having said this, having laid this foundation, as indicated by the policy brief, yes, we have this normative framework in place, and also we also have the principles. But the policy rightly indicated that there are different challenges in time of implementation. And I quite agree. And that is the reason why the African Union has decided to put in place some initiative to address the limited participation, the unpalatable level of participation of member states. I mean the youth in policy process. But I will narrow it down to the transitional justice and also indicate what we have been doing to promote youth participation in transitional justice processes on the continent. The first one was before the development and adoption of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, and in conjunction with CSVR, we had a continental consultation with the youth on development of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And that is the reason why, if you look at the policy, you will see that from section 105 to 108, it comprehensively reflects the position that the African youth gave us as African Union that they want to see in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. So for us at the African Union with regard to transitional justice, we walk our talk. And that is the reason why, because of that, following that consultation with the youth, the recommendation was what exactly we put in the AU Transitional Justice Policy from section 105 to 108. In addition to that, in order to overcome the tokenistic challenge of youth participation in transitional justice processes, what we have done as African Union is to put in place a comprehensive continental youth program on transitional justice on the continent. And that was why we had what we call a program called the African Youth for Transitional Justice, AY for TJP. And that is the reason why my colleague Usani Odoom will be speaking very soon. This is that project that brought him on board, because as you can see, I'm no longer a youth within the range of the definition of the African Union. And so we have to bring in a youth to coordinate that continental platform program on youths and transitional justice. And we have been doing a lot. In addition to the training that we have been doing, we have had 2 sets of training for the youth, where we have about 100 youth that we have trained across the continent. We know that that is not enough. We need to do more, and we are planning to do more in that area. Now, the policy also talk about the challenge. I'm saying this thing because of my time. It also raised the gender dimension of youth participation in TJ, particularly the female gender. That is, they are more even affected when it comes to the participation. And that is the reason why for us, we have not just stopped at the level of having a concrete program that will promote youth participation in policy and in TJ processes. We are also planning a program called the African Women for Transitional Justice Program. It is going to include training, capacity building, and all the rest of them. And we will be focusing on the youth, the women's youth, to make sure that their roles are, taken care of and to ensure that they participate critically. So in a nutshell, these are some of the things that the African Union has been doing to ensure that youth are fully involved in the process. And in addition to the training that we have been doing, what we are currently doing is also to ensure that we provide technical support to some of our member states in transitional justice so that youth can participate in the process. And take, for example, the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission. If you look at the work that they do, they have different committees. And one of the committee in the TRRC is we have also a youth committee. And we work together as African Union using the AUTJP. And that was the reason why you will see that the youth were very active in the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission. And that is exactly the type of support that we are providing to some of our member states, currently in South Sudan and also in Libya. And also even now in Ethiopia, we are currently translating the African Union Transitional Justice Policy to make sure that we have it in Amharic, the official language, so that all different stakeholders, not only youth, will also be involved in TJ processes across board. But like I said, we currently have a very comprehensive program for youth involvement, full participation in transitional justice process, which Usani will talk about. Now, finally, the regional economic community, we are also encouraging them as they are currently developing their own transitional justice mechanism, that they should use the African Union Transitional Justice Policy and ensure that the marginalized groups, particularly the youth, the women, the people living with disability, and the elderly people, the victims, are fully involved in TJ process. So the African Union is working in this particular area. Now, another thing that we have also done to make sure that we reach, different stakeholders is the translation of the transitional justice policy that I said. We have translated it into Amharic. We have also translated it into Swahili. We have also translated it into Lesotho. And we will continue to do that to make sure that we cover different stakeholders, not only youth, but other stakeholders. Finally, in conclusion, the African Youth for Transitional Justice platform that the African Union has established was established just last year in 2021 to address all the challenges and problems that were raised in this policy brief. And so what we need to do is that we need all of us, we need to join hands together with this platform, continental platform on youth, on transitional justice that has just been established, so that all of us can work together and jointly address all the challenges that has been raised in the policy briefs. Once again, thank you very much for prioritizing youth on transitional justice for the research, and we do look forward to continue collaboration with CSVR and Impunity Watch to address these challenges raised in the policy. I thank you.
Wow, Mr. Ikubaje, I cannot thank you enough for that. So much of what you shared is so exciting, and I'm sure most people that are hearing it for the first time, we are really seeing for the first time that the African Union truly is engaged with this issue. So that is very, very exciting for us. So I just want to thank you very much for bringing the voice of the African Union to this platform. Because as you know, one of the key points of this entire project is to bridge the gap between continental policymakers such as yourself and the youth that are here present. Thank you also for just highlighting about the UN Human Rights Council, for example, that that the critical mechanisms are also seized with this issue and are seeking to see how youth can be more included. I'm also happy to hear even that the African Union, the African Union believes that without the participation of critical stakeholders such as the youth, that we can't have the Africa that we want. And that is so true, particularly given that this is the youngest population. The youth are the future, are they not? Thank you for taking cognizance of that. Really to thank the African Union for taking cognizance of that and actually meaningfully developing policies that take that into account. Very, very exciting to hear about that continental policy frameworks have always encouraged the inclusivity and meaningful participation of all stakeholders, including youth. I think most participants here, especially the youth, were very happy to hear about this continental framework that you've put in place for African youth, the comprehensive youth program for transitional justice. And that truly is not just a tokenist approach, as you said. For example, you already showed us that not only did you consult with youth when you were formulating the policy itself, which is fantastic on its own, but that you actually included the voices of the youth and the recommendations that they'd made as evidence in section 105 to section 108 of the policy itself. And the fact that apart from that, not only is it included the views and perspectives, but you've already trained 100 youth. That to me indeed shows that the African Union is walking the talk. And also, I think for all women here, the gender dimensions that you brought in, and this, your African Women program, African Women for TJ program, that is a fantastic initiative. We are so grateful to the African Union for the inclusion, for recognizing the unique challenges and obstacles that women face in these processes, and for seeking to address that and ensuring that women can be fully involved in that process. And I think lastly, it was so wonderful to hear as well that the trickle down that is happening from the continental level to the national levels, because as youth we engage at the national levels most of the time, and that you're bringing the technical assistance to those levels and helping our government sort of realize how they can actualize these policies and actually include youth in the national processes. And also very exciting to hear about the translation that is happening of the policy to make it more accessible to most of us. Thank you so much. I think I can safely say that perhaps there is hope after all for youth inclusion, youth participation in transitional justice processes, especially at the continental level. And participants, I look forward to you engaging the issues that the African Union, that Mr. John Ikubaje has raised from the African Union point of view. So without much further ado, sorry I took up time, but really that was so exciting to hear all these opportunities that the African Union. We are now moving to our next distinguished panelist, Mr. Usani Odoom, who holds an LLM in Human Rights and Democratization from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. His research areas include human rights and transitional justice and reparations for victims of violence in post-conflict societies. He previously worked at the Department of Political Affairs of the African Commission, now PAPS in Ethiopia, and later as a human rights expert at the African Court in Arusha, Tanzania, where he advised on reparations for human rights violations generally and on the rights of indigenous communities. Mr. Odoom, over to you. We are very happy to have you with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope we can all hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. I guess I have to start by commending John for such a passionate presentation, which speaks to the fact that even though he's running away from being a youth, he's still a youth at heart. And on that note, I would also commend CSVR and Impunity Watch for addressing a very important concept, which is the very idea of the youth, which in my opinion is even more important, or is more than just a biological construct of a fixed age. Because this is particularly important to help us situate the discourse about who exactly is a youth and who is not. Because in some cultures, hello?
Sorry about that.
Okay. Because in some cultures, in Nigeria, for example, the Igbo culture, a girl is considered to be a youth or is considered to be responsible once she's able to carry her younger sibling behind her back and cater for them. In the same way, a young boy is considered to be a youth or responsible once he's able to hold a machete in his hand. So this goes beyond just the definition of a youth as we might have it in the normative instruments like the African Youth Charter, or as might be constructed by different policy documents. As has been identified in the policy brief we're talking about now, violent conflict has been rightly identified as capable of altering this matrix of development for a lot of young people in Africa. And as such, even a 10-year-old boy may have at his age the responsibility of youth thrust violently into his hands, like when they are conscripted into the insurgencies like child soldiers, while a 12-year-old girl might have her youth torn violently from her, like the very garment she's wearing, when they are raped and sexually abused or forcefully become sex slaves in the context of the war. This, of course, is replicated in nearly all the crises we see on the continent, especially this Boko Haram situation in Northeast Nigeria, and recently the report released by the United Nations and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, as we see also in the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia. On the flip side also, the consequences of violent conflict can perpetuate young people in the state of youthfulness way beyond 40 years. In fact, from the policy we have just considered, a youth was quoted at page 7 that your views would not matter if you're from South Sudan unless you are 45 years of age or more. So for them, you are still a youth until you are 45 years and more. But whatever the situation is about how we situate who exactly is a youth and who is not, I think we are all in agreement on the disproportionate impact of war and violent conflict on young people, which may have even become, which usually would become even more complex if we consider such other intersectionalities, like when somebody is a youth and is also a girl without education, or when you are a youth and you're a girl who is also displaced, or when you are a youth and you're a girl, and you're a refugee or a stateless person. These are the intersectionalities that can make their peculiar circumstances even more difficult to talk about. Now, there is also a plausible but erroneous argument, which is existing in literature, that youth should be included in TJ policy formulation and its implementation only because they usually constitute the violent force which drives every conflict on the continent. This argument presupposes that the relevance of youth in TJ should flow from their role as a purveyors of violence. It appears beautiful, but the logic is problematic because it automatically sidelines young women and girls, since they usually do not take active part in the actual fighting. And as such, if we go by that logic, should not be involved in TJ policy development. But the point we want to emphasize is that young people, including young women and girls, must be part of TJ processes first, because they are an integral part of the society. And second, because despite they not taking active part in the actual violence, they usually, we're very relevant with this information, they usually suffer a different kind of violence, which includes conflict-related sexual violence. And like a respondent once told me in Northeast Nigeria in the context of Boko Haram during a field trip to that region, she said, even after the war is brought to an end, even after the guns have been silenced, women still grapple with another kind of war within their bodies, of the scars, of the trauma, of the psychological impact of their lived experiences. So these are the issues we must consider if we have to involve women in TJ policy implementation. We cannot talk about justice that is relevant to women unless they are involved in the processes of developing even the policy and, of course, its implementation. Would justice be relevant to them if it does not relate to them? Of course not. And then to me, in all of these, marginalization of youth in policy formulation in most African society is maybe twofold, or if you like, three or more. Like I said earlier, depending on the intersectionalities, which I mentioned already. First, youths are usually marginalized. And then because they are youth, and then they are marginalized because they are youth and they are women and girls, for which, of course, religious and social or cultural restrictions play a major role, which the policy we are talking about has also highlighted. And this is where, in my opinion, the AUTJP comes in. The AUTJP, for those who are not familiar, is, of course, is the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which has provided a better foundation for youth involvement in both TJ policy formulation and its implementation. Now, the AUTJP did not lump all youths into the same category, but it recognized their peculiar experiences and then made policy recommendation for them in TJ processes. No. So apart from categorizing youth as one of the most vulnerable groups during conflict, it also categorized women and girls separately. Thus, in cases where young women and girls are marginalized because they are youth, the AUTJ policy contemplates that they should be accommodated because they are women and girls and usually suffer disproportionate harm during conflict. Now, in consideration of all the challenges which this policy document has highlighted, speaks to the very challenge that we all are familiar with, namely the lack of sincerity on the part of the political leadership, the lack of capacity by youth and youth-led organizations to actively take part in TJ policy formulation and implementation. We also have the challenge of social, cultural, and religious impediment, especially against women and girls. These are all the issues already addressed by the African Union, African Youth Charter, which emphasizes on the need to involve young people in governance generally, and has already been addressed by the Maputo Protocol, which calls for the elimination of all forms of discrimination and then restrictions, both religious, cultural, and societal restrictions against women, and encourage their involvement in the policy formulation and governance generally. And then ultimately, we'll talk about the AUTJP, which has mentioned women and girls as critical stakeholders. That is why for we at the African Union, especially as project officer for the African Youth for Transitional Justice. We are already doing a lot with the youth in terms of capacity building through trainings and mentorship in TJ among all AU member states. Interestingly, most of our trainees are here attending this event, and their very presence in this event speak to their interest in TJ in their respective society and at the regional level. So with the availability of support from relevant key stakeholders with member states, we hope to replicate this type of trainings across all the regions, if not all member states, to enhance their understanding first about TJ itself, and then encourage their participation. And then, of course, like John has talked about, the bulk of the work, no matter how ambitious we want to be, the bulk of the work will rest with respective member states of the AU, who, of course, remain the primary duty bearers for the implementation of any policy recommendation. I guess I should stop here so I make time for other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Usani, for that engagement, and we continue to be encouraged from the African Union. Thank you just for showing us how indeed inclusion of the youth can actually alter the matrix of development in Africa. And thank you also especially for engaging on this issue of the lived realities of the youth in Africa, particularly in conflict zones, of the child soldiers, of what happens to young women in particular, young girls in particular, of just how the norms and discourses, the cultural as well, how all of this impact on how they experience conflict and post-conflict contexts. And, I think what you were doing was just helping to highlight the disproportionate impact and effect, if you want, of all of this in terms of youth being able to engage. And, and I thank you for that, because you are helping us to overcome those harmful narratives that we spoke about in the beginning. You are showing us what are the actual obstacles, what are the actual practical challenges that youth face in Africa, that make it so difficult for them to engage and to participate. And thank you also, I think, for really speaking to the marginalization and experiences of young African women, and raising the issues that you believe that we must consider if we are to successfully include African youth. I think you very much advanced this whole agenda in that regard. And also, thank you also just for sharing what the program, the Youth in TJ program is doing, the capacity building, the mentorship that is happening across regions. I think this is very critical in light of one of the findings that there is a need to popularize the AUTJP. So thank you that you are including the youth in that. This capacity building is happening. And finally, I want to thank you so much for acknowledging our participants that are here present. Thank you for acknowledging that, that they are here, because this shows the commitment of African youth to these issues. This shows that these harmful narratives are unfounded, and that youth are indeed committed to these processes, that if you create the opportunities and the platforms, youth will show up. So thank you so much for that. That is a critical point that needed to be made and to be shown. I now want to turn to give the floor to our last panelist, Ms. Lydie Akonkwa. She's a lawyer by training. She practices law as a lawyer in Bukavu, Eastern DRC. She's also involved in a number of civil society activities. And as I said, I really think her participation is so important here. Not only is she representing us, the young women, but she is also representing the youth, and she was also one of the research participants in this project. Ms. Lydie, you are so very welcome here, and I hand the floor over to you. Very much looking forward to your contribution. Thank you. Oh, sorry, just to add that she'll be speaking in French. So all the English speakers, you want to now go to interpretation box and switch on your English interpretation so you can hear the simultaneous interpretation. Thank you. Ms. Lydie, the floor is yours.
Oui, c'est Madame Lydie Akonkwa. Je suis l'une des participants à la recherche et à la question de la recherche sur l'inclusion de la jeunesse dans les politiques de la justice transitionnelle en Afrique. Je présente d'abord mes excuses. Pour le désagrément du fait que je viens d'intervenir un peu en retard. C'était dû à la perturbation de la connexion avec le pluie ces derniers temps ici chez nous, en RDC. Comprenez quand même que nous sommes là aussi et on a quand même un mot à placer par rapport à cette thématique que nous sommes en train de discuter aujourd'hui. Mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et qualités respectifs, bonjour. C'est pour nous un grand honneur de nous retrouver parmi nous ou parmi vous dans ces échanges qui portent sur l'inclusion des jeunes dans les politiques de la justice transitionnelle en Afrique, recommandations et pistes de solutions. L'inclusion des jeunes dans les efforts de conception et de mise en œuvre des initiatives de justice transitionnelle est désormais considérée comme une priorité essentielle, longtemps négligée. Une telle inclusion et participation renforcerait la valeur ajoutée de ces initiatives au bénéfice de la société et leur mise en adéquation avec les priorités et points de vue des jeunes. Historiquement, les acteurs du secteur de la justice transitionnelle ne parvenaient pas à s'assurer de l'implication des jeunes dans leurs différentes initiatives et ont été lents à saisir les opportunités offertes par l'inclusion des jeunes. En tant que partie prenante aussi sur ces processus, dès lors que beaucoup de questions peuvent se poser, comment les jeunes peuvent-ils être inclus dans les processus de politique? Quels sont les obstacles auxquels ils font face? En quoi ressemblerait un programme de justice transitionnelle adapté aux jeunes? Et pour répondre à ces questions, Impunity Watch et CSVR sont allés auprès de ces jeunes pour les écouter. Ce thème qui retient notre attention aujourd'hui est l'un d'autres thèmes qui ont fait l'objet de recherches en octobre, novembre et décembre 2021 à laquelle nous avions participé activement. Au cours de cette recherche, il s'est avéré que la plupart de jeunes n'ont pas su ce que c'est la justice transitionnelle, ni moins encore les politiques de la justice transitionnelle de l'Union africaine et son appel à l'inclusion de la jeunesse africaine en général et des femmes en particulier, dans tous les aspects ou phases d'élaboration de la politique et des processus de justice transitionnelle. Mais après explication du chercheur, ces concepts des politiques transitionnelles et aussi ces concepts aussi de politique de justice transitionnelle de l'Union africaine ont été ancrés dans le mémoire de ces jeunes. Les jeunes ont approuvé à l'unanimité cet appel, tout en estimant que la réalisation des engagements qu'il contient dépendait fortement des volontés politiques et de la mise en œuvre des politiques. L'absence d'inclusion significative et de redevabilité en matière de mise en œuvre des politiques a comme conséquence que de nombreux jeunes considèrent que les politiques, comme des documents soigneusement rédigés, remplis de bonnes intentions, ne sont pas souvent réalisés. Pour savoir si les jeunes participent à l'élaboration politique nationale en RDC, par exemple, les points de vue ont été divergents. En s'exprimant, les jeunes pensaient qu'ils ne sont pas du tout associés lorsqu'il s'agit de prendre des décisions importantes. Et là où on essaie de prendre en compte leurs opinions, cela s'est fait de manière timide. Étant donné que les jeunes font partie des victimes, surtout les femmes, que nous sommes dans le conflit qui se vit en Afrique tout entière et en particulier en République démocratique du Congo, surtout pour nous qui sommes à l'est de ces grands pays, et sont souvent manipulés pour commettre des atrocités. Leur participation active au règlement des différends est indispensable afin de l'instauration de la paix durable. Ainsi, bien que l'importance de l'inclusion des jeunes ait été formellement reconnue comme principe clé pour la mise en place des processus de justice transitionnelle appropriés et adaptés, ces implications concrètes restent floues. Pour ce faire, pendant cette recherche, les jeunes que nous sommes et femmes que nous sommes aussi ont eu à formuler certaines recommandations pour une mise en application de la justice transitionnelle, aussi bien que par la politique à savoir faire connaître et vulgariser le concept de justice transitionnelle et la politique de justice transitionnelle de l'Union africaine, mettre en place des structures du niveau local au niveau national, permettant de faciliter la participation des jeunes au processus d'élaboration des politiques de justice transitionnelle, veiller à une meilleure représentation des jeunes au sein des structures décisionnelles, acquisition et transfert des compétences et mentorat, remettre en question des discours et des normes qui font perdurer l'exclusion de jeunes et des femmes en particulier, garantir la redevabilité à l'égard de la mise en œuvre des politiques de justice transitionnelle, reconnaître la multiplicité des besoins et des points de vue de jeunes et des femmes, lutter contre les effets liés au genre qui empêchent de participer au processus d'élaboration des politiques de justice transitionnelle. Mais comme c'est la grande question. Certains jeunes ont estimé que leur génération est moins susceptible d'être incluse de manière significative et plus susceptible de voir sa vulnérabilité plutôt économique exploitée à des fins politiques. Alors, les jeunes, et plus particulièrement les femmes, devraient eux-mêmes prendre conscience et reconnaître l'atout majeur qu'ils représentent. Ils devraient être des vrais acteurs et non des simples observateurs. Aussi, les autorités devraient prendre en compte leurs aptitudes et leurs capacités pour permettre à cette justice transitionnelle de voir le jour et d'être effective sur le terrain, parce qu'on penserait que les jeunes qui sont exclus ne peuvent rien faire. Et alors, la meilleure façon de les faire participer, c'est de prendre en compte ces atouts et leur participation pour permettre à cette justice transitionnelle de ne pas rester une lettre morte, mais quand même que ça puisse permettre à l'évolution de notre société, parce qu'on en a besoin surtout dans ces pays où nous avons eu à connaître des violences à répétition. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lydie Akonkwa, for that presentation. And thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing the perspectives of the youth on this forum. But also, I just wanted to say, by the way, there was no need to apologize at all. You were right on time, speaking at the right time. So no, thank you for being here. And also just thank you for sharing the perspectives of the youth, as I've said. And I think you raised some really critical issues that we hadn't touched on today as yet. And, you know, one of those critical issues that you raised is that of implementation. That, you know, it is all very well and good to have these very progressive policies. But if we do not implement, if that progressive vision is not implemented, then we have nothing, right? And also raising the issue of accountability with regards to that implementation. I think that is a critical issue that I hope some of the participants will engage in as well. So how do we ensure that this progressive policies and laws and platforms actually implement the vision that it's seeking to realize? And I think also, thank you just for calling on the youth that, that we now we have to be real actors, not just observers. I really like that, and you are absolutely right. We have to be actors and not just observers if we're going to make this reality of youth inclusion and youth participation real, and something that hopefully we can achieve in our lifetime at a very comprehensive level. So thank you very much for your contribution. So ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to that time on our program where we now open the floor up to the participants for a discussion on these issues that have been raised. So we'll do this in two ways. You can either raise your hand and our technical assistant will unmute you for you to be able to make your contribution. Or you can ask your question in the chat, and I can then give it to either of our presenters or our panelists. So with that, the floor is open. I hope for a robust engagement on this very, very important and central issue. I think that much has been established. Esther, if you can please unmute our first raised hand. So please just introduce yourself and what you do or where you're from, and then ask your question or make your contribution. Thank you. So Esther, can the people raise their hands speak?
Yes, they may. I have unmuted.
Oh, okay. Perhaps, do you maybe just want to say, and because they won't know if they can, just say the name of the first person unmuted.
Africa Reconciled.
Thank you.
You may have the floor.
Africa Reconciled, please, you have the floor. You can share your contribution. Sorry, Africa Reconciled, are you speaking?
Okay, allez-y. Merci pour la parole. Moi, c'est Léon B. Bankoubir, je suis coordonnateur du réseau d'aide aux femmes et enfants nécessités. On est partenaire de Impunity Watch et on a participé à ce processus de justice transitionnelle depuis le début. Alors, après le rapport de l'étude, nous nous sommes appropriés l'étude. Et comme nous travaillons avec d'autres partenaires, nous nous sommes sentis dans l'obligation d'essayer de partager l'idée de l'étude avec les partenaires qui sont les bailleurs de fonds, comme on a discuté avec la Banque mondiale, il y a l'USAID. Parce que dans le processus, nous, c'est comme si la communauté était déjà en avance. Parce qu'ici, en RDC, il y a la jeunesse qui se bat pour essayer de dénoncer, obliger au gouvernement d'intégrer le processus de la justice transitionnelle. Et nous, nos interlocuteurs nous ont posé quand même quelques problèmes par rapport au processus, où il y a par exemple le problème de l'échantillon, où on parle que 300 jeunes ont participé à l'étude pour 4 pays. Alors, je pense que l'échantillon n'est pas vraiment suffisant. Ça, c'est une préoccupation. Il y a aussi le problème de l'Union africaine, même si la jeunesse pouvait participer à l'élaboration de la politique. Alors, nous avons eu beaucoup d'incidents ici par rapport au projet Banque mondiale. Il y a récemment OMS avec la riposte Ebola. Il y a beaucoup de politiques qui existent sur la violence sexuelle, sur le problème déjà, mais malheureusement, on est dans des États, on dit États fragiles, où par exemple, il y a même des zones où l'État, il y a un problème d'autorité de l'État. Et là, ça pose un problème de l'applicabilité de la politique, de nombreuses politiques qui existent, et même si d'autres ici pouvaient exister. Et voilà, dans l'étude, je pense qu'on n'a pas beaucoup insisté sur, peut-être que les rapports voulaient être plus diplomatiques, mais on n'a pas insisté sur la fragilité de nos États, où c'est les États où l'autorité de l'État n'existe pas. Et là, voilà ma contribution sous forme de préoccupation. Merci.
Thank you. Oh, no, not at all. Thank you so much for trying. Thank you, our colleagues from Africa Reconciled, for raising those issues. And I don't know if any of the presenters or panelists want to maybe respond to any of the issues that were raised. Otherwise, I'll ask Esther to please unmute the next person and just let them know that you've unmuted them and that they can share.
We don't seem to have more contribution from the attendees list.
Oh.
Just a moment, we have one more.
Yes, I think there is someone from some people from the DRC, Bukavu, who would like to ask questions. Maybe they can just write in the chat or raise their hand. Yes.
I think Ayola, Esther, are you able to allow Ayola to speak?
Yes, she may.
Okay, Ayola Emmanuel, you may make your contribution.
Can I hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
All right. So interesting conversation so far about the involvement. Okay, thank you. About the involvement of young people in promoting transitional justice. I think we must not, and certainly we should not, be talking about TJ processes, in the continent without thinking of youth involvement. My intervention is basically as it relates to the importance of taking it a step further. All right. So beyond actually involving young people effectively in TJ processes, there's the need to also trust their agency, where we also begin to see them not just as collaborators or participants, but we begin to now see them as leaders, where they're able to also drive those processes, within their various member states. And I also certainly think that TJ processes would have a lot to do with the active participation and involvement of young people within the region. And we must also begin to think of how we want to invade the spaces where these young people have those conversations. We need to begin to popularize TJ processes among young people. So how do we talk about the new media? How do we actively use social media? How do we actively use pop culture to popularize TJ processes among young people? Because certainly without their involvement, there's only so far we can go in terms of promoting TJ processes. Thanks, everyone. Wonderful conversation so far.
Thank you, Ayola. Thank you for those comments. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the next challenge, really, or the next step, having acknowledged the importance of this issue, having created all the opportunities and the platforms, is to now make young people aware of these opportunities, of their agency, of the fact that their agency is now appreciated and is indeed needed in these processes. And I think you're absolutely right. Social media campaigns, pop culture are some of the best avenues we can use, but I guess the question is how do we use that to popularize something that hopefully we can all think about. I don't know if any of the presenters or the panelists want to engage some of what has been shared so far. Otherwise, Gentil, may I ask if you can read, or the interpreter, if you can read the comments that are being made in French, in case there are any questions there, or just so we can also hear the contribution of our French colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments made so far. There are also some questions from people from Bukavu, I think. They're trying to ask the floor, but I don't know. So there's someone saying, okay, bonjour à tous. Maybe the interpreter will help interpret this. Bonjour à tous. C'est bien de parler de la participation des jeunes dans la justice transitionnelle. Il ne faut pas séparer la participation des jeunes dans toutes les instances de prise de décision. Si les jeunes sont présentés dans les instances de prise de décision, je pense qu'ils peuvent aussi participer dans la justice transitionnelle. So this person is saying that, I think it was translated, it was interpreted. Okay. Yeah, so those are some of the points made in French. Il faut amener les autorités à s'approprier la justice transitionnelle, surtout en RDC. And that's another comment from the DRC. Oh, okay. Yeah, so.
Thank you for that.
Are there any strategic partnerships with the AU member states to see those policies to be implemented through youth initiatives, programs? Yeah, there is a question in the chat saying, are there any strategic partnerships with the AU member states to see those policies be implemented through youth initiatives, programs? I think that was a bit covered by what John and Usani shared. But if they have additional comments to make, they can go ahead, please.
Thank you, Gentil. Usani, please, may you make your contribution?
Okay, it's going to be very brief in response to your last question about the use of the new media in youth advocacy or campaign for the popularization or inclusion in TJ processes. We understand that previously, African youths have demonstrated a very good ability to mobilize, to use the social media to mobilize for different causes before. For example, the Fee Must Fall protest in South Africa, the Occupy Khartoum in Sudan, and then later the NSAS movement in Nigeria. These are all instances where youth have demonstrated the ability to use the new media and social media generally to mobilize support and drive home their causes within the shortest time possible. From the experiences we had training youth in TJ participation recently, we've had a very positive response from young people who had taken part in this training. And within a short time from when they had this training till now, several youths in their respective countries have organized virtual training. They are now serving like trainers themselves after they have been trained to train other youths in their localities and communities. So I believe that even though we are not yet there, there is a lot of potential in the use of social media in advancing our goals in popularizing and enhancing youth participation in TJ processes. We can still do more, and we want to encourage a lot of youth. When we have these programs in the future, we want to make their use of social media in propagating the ideals of the TJP as one of these. And we are very sure that just as we African youths have used social media to enhance their cause in the past, we can also use it effectively to ensure that they take effective participation in both policy implementation and what have you. And then the other person spoke about what was the question on, okay, maybe I could just read the inbox and then I'll respond accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Usani. Thank you for that. I think also just for highlighting once again the commitment of youth to these issues, as you've shown from the example of what the youth you trained are doing in their countries. Thank you for that. Mr. John Ikubaje, please go ahead. I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you very much for that questions. There are so many questions, but the one that we want to address has to do with the relationship between the African Union and the member states, particularly on implementation. Definitely, one of our plan is to continue, training and also providing capacity building for youths, on transitional justice, and just like the policy did recommend. But in addition to that, the other strategy we are using now is looking at member states that are currently implementing transitional justice programs, countries like South Sudan, countries like Sierra Leone, countries like Libya, Sudan, and some others, Libya, and all the rest of them. Then we look at youth, and we are currently mobilizing some resources to look at how we can actually support youth so that they can be, in political science, we talk about being in the center of the center, of the policy processes in time of implementation. So those are the type of initiative that we are trying to come on board so that it might be little, support where we are able to situate our youths with understanding of TJ in the center of transitional justice mechanisms, so that like what happened in the Gambia, so that we can support in our own little way, those group, the youth committee, of transitional justice mechanism. So that is what we are currently working on. Definitely, we will be having another meeting with the youth, particularly those that we have trained, to see what some of them are actually doing. And those that are working, then we look at how we can provide our own little seed of support to those that are hands-on, in time of implementation of TJ. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, just for, really highlighting that what's happening practically between the AU and its member states. And I really like what you're saying, that you're mobilizing, seeking to mobilize resources to put youth at the center. I hope the youth can hear that and really take advantage and exercise their agency in the countries where this is happening. Ms. Lydie, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Oui, je viens de suivre quelques commentaires qui sont déposés par les participants et cela me donne envie de mettre un mot, de placer un mot par rapport à cette participation de la jeunesse à la politique de la justice transitionnelle de l'Union africaine et la justice transitionnelle en elle-même. Cela nous permet de dire ceci aux jeunes, qu'il y a déjà des outils qui sont déjà mis sur pied, et au niveau interne et au niveau international, qui nous permettent maintenant d'entrer en action. Entre autres, par exemple, nous avons la résolution 2250 du Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU, qui a été adoptée en 2015, qui nous permet quand même de poser aussi des actes et de ne pas être seulement observateurs, d'être aussi participants et ne pas attendre que les autorités politiques puissent nous booster ou nous venir en aide. On doit d'abord poser nous-mêmes le premier pas et demander maintenant de l'aide à nos autorités si ça vaut quand même la peine. Et pour y arriver, pour y parvenir, l'un des piliers qui nous permet de poser des actes en tant que jeunes actifs dans ce processus de politique de justice transitionnelle, nous avons l'action de sensibilisation et de coordination. Et donc, on doit sensibiliser les jeunes qui puissent d'abord eux-mêmes comprendre qu'est-ce que cette justice transitionnelle, qu'ils puissent s'approprier ces concepts et que ça ne reste pas seulement un concept, mais que ça puisse, que ça fasse partie quand même de notre quotidien pour que les mesures qui sont prévues par l'Union africaine afin de mettre en place cette politique soient quand même bien menées au niveau interne et au niveau international, mais aussi que les jeunes fassent partie de la solution, qu'ils ne soient plus des problèmes, qu'ils n'acceptent plus d'être manipulés afin de voir cette justice mise en place, mais aussi mobiliser les jeunes à leurs responsabilités. Ils peuvent être des modérateurs, des médiateurs dans ces processus de conflit, surtout ici chez nous, là où vraiment les conflits intercommunautaire, par exemple, est devenu quelque chose de normal. Les jeunes peuvent changer l'image du monde à travers cette participation dans le processus d'un dialogue dans notre société en conflit. Et donc, je demande à nos jeunes que nous sommes de participer activement, ne pas attendre toujours que l'on puisse nous donner un tonus, mais que nous-mêmes nous cherchons quelque chose qui peut nous permettre d'ouvrir le chemin et que cette justice transitionnelle puisse bien avoir le jour et que ça puisse aussi s'installer directement dans notre vie quotidienne comme les autres mesures des règlements de conflits que nous avons eu à connaître dans le passé. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Lydie. Thank you for reminding us about the UN Security Council Resolution 250 on youth and children. You know, I think it just shows that the importance of this issue is being recognized at the highest levels. And I think also for really emphasizing one of the key messages of this project, that youth should be seen as part of the solution, not the problem. And yeah, and just for encouraging us as youth to participate and to get involved. Thank you for that. Esther, I think there's a hand that's in the main group.
Yes,
Omara.
I think we can have Omara.
Thank you. Yes, please. Omara is was our lead researcher on the ground in South Sudan. Omara, please, I hand the floor over to you. Omara, you need to unmute if you're speaking.
All right, are you getting me?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Thank you very much. We're a bit facing some connection problems, but all along we managed to get everything that the panelists have been talking about. And we really want to thank the panelists and I guess that spoke all over. With regards to South Sudan, like one of the panelists said, actually, that African Union will be able to help countries that are working on transitional justice, that have already got the programs for transitional justice, that include South Sudan, Sierra Leone, and others that are yet emerging from the conflict. South Sudan so far in the peace agreement, chapter 5 of the peace agreement talks about establishment of some mechanisms and institutions that cherish transitional justice. But of course, we know that during the drafting of that peace agreement, it was just an option because all the parties to the warring parties during the conflict never accepted anything to do with transitional justice and never wanted the inclusion of chapter 5, which talks about the establishment of the 3 institutions that includes the hybrid court, compensation and reparation authority, and the truth healing and reconciliation commission. These facets of institutions were supposed to be established, but up to date, none of them has been established. And I'm made to understand African Union is supposed to establish a hybrid court. But to date, the African Union has not taken any step. So we wonder exactly what will happen because that's supposed to be the mandate of African Union. Now we have transitional justice, African Union transitional justice policy, and we really don't understand why that policy has not been invoked with regards to South Sudan. So to us, I think it is very paramount to push up this policy and the policy brief to the relevant stakeholders such that we'll be able to achieve what we have started in South Sudan. However, it's a bit perilous for us here in South Sudan because there is no political will to implement the mechanisms of transitional justice, although most of the things are being pushed to the government. But initially they said that was not the idea. It was the idea of the civil society that brought the inclusion of Chapter 5 into the peace agreement. So therefore, it is a humble appeal that we have the representative of African Union that if they're able to push forward, make sure that the Chapter 5 of the peace agreement comes to effect, that will be quite relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Omara, for that. I'm going to allow Mr. Ikubaje to respond to you. Thank you, sir.
Maybe I would suggest that Mr. John wait for another question. Maybe it will relate to that or a similar comment. But also, as we are approaching to end, maybe add to in some practical ways how we will go forward with the recommendations made by the youth in terms of their implementations. So thank you.
Thank you, Gentil. May I perhaps also ask if you can maybe, if someone can read out some of the comments in the chat?
Oh, yes. There is one comment that I would like to read. It says, j'aimerais demander si les jeunes étaient représentés lors de l'élaboration du programme des jeunes au sein de l'Union africaine sur la justice transitionnelle. So it's basically saying whether they are asking whether youth were consulted when the AUTJP was being elaborated. So whether youth took part in the process.
Yes, I believe that question has been answered, that indeed they took part, they were consulted, and not only consulted, but their recommendations and views were included in section 105 to 108 of the policy. And then after that, there was also training of at least 100 youth at the moment on the AUTJP. Mr. John, I don't know if you want to speak now or to wait for more comments, particularly on recommendations and way forward.
Thank you very much. I think you've really bailed me out by helping me to answer the second question, whether the youth participated in the development of the policy fully. The youth participated fully, and not only participation, but their recommendation were reflected in the policy that was eventually adopted. And that is the reason why we have the basis, for us to come up with comprehensive program for our youth participation in TJ processes on the continent. Now let me also thank Mr. Omara Joseph for his question. Currently, as we speak, the African Union Peace and Security Council, they are currently in South Sudan, engaging the political leaders, not only the political leaders, but all stakeholders. They were in Jonglei State, was it yesterday? So they are engaging different stakeholders to see how far the country has gone on implementation of the revitalized agreement, including Chapter 5 that deals with transitional justice, and also focusing on those 3 TJ mechanisms that you did reference to. Now, this is where we are. Particularly, you know that the task force has been established, particularly on the Truth Commission, and we are following up on that. We also had a meeting with all the ministers affected, the Minister for Constitutionalism and Ministry of Justice. We had a meeting in December on how to go about that. But, you know, there are processes. Like, for example, the hybrid court. For us at the African Union, the AU Office of the Legal Counsel, we have developed some certain instruments that need to be signed. Without signing all those documents, it is difficult. The AU cannot just wake up and impose actions on TJ, on the court on South Sudan. You know, there are principles that regulate the interaction between the African Union and also its member states. And one of these principles is that there must be a consensus, there must be an agreement. So the MOU and some other documentation that we are jointly developing must be assented to by the member state, which is this time around is the South Sudan government. So that is where we are, and they have promised that they will be meeting with us. So those are some of the issues that our political leaders, the Peace and Security Council, that are meeting with the relevant institutions, the leadership, including the president and the vice president, they are meeting all of them. So we will look forward to see the outcome. Hopefully that they will agree and they will sign, and from there we do the operationalization of the hybrid court on South Sudan. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that, sir, and just for, I guess, highlighting the complexities inherent in political processes, but also I think just once again showing the commitment of the African Union to these processes, particularly the TJ process. Thank you for that. So I think we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone wants to make contributions towards the way forward, to perhaps add to the recommendations like Gentil was suggesting, please let us know. I see there are more messages in the chat. I don't know if someone wants to please translate that for us so we can also get that contribution. And yeah, so I think maybe once we read the messages in chat, we'll take one or two hands,
Maybe,
and then I'll hand over to Anna to close. Sorry, Gentil, go ahead.
I saw, does Africa Reconcile want to say something else? Maybe it's another person from there. And then I will read quickly, maybe in 2 minutes, some of the comments in French.
No problem, thank you. So our colleagues from Africa Reconcile, please go ahead.
There's also Chido Pamela who wants to say something.
Okay. So I think let's give Chido a chance since this is her first contribution. Chido, please go ahead. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, we can hear you.
Chido, we can hear you. Thanks.
All right, thank you. No, I just wanted to thank the organizers and the panelists for hosting such an insightful discussion, which really also ties in very well. Maybe to just give an introduction, I'm Chido Pamela Mafongoya, legal practitioner. I'm based in Zimbabwe, and as part of the AY for TJ program in Kenya in November, I was one of the attendees for that program. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for also giving us a platform, you know, to be included in such discussions and to really just, it's so informative because it really just feeds into everything that we also learned under the African Union AY for TJ program, and it brings everything, it puts everything like into perspective. So I don't really have much of a comment on the substantive discussions and some of the ideas and the background of what was really discussed upon, but just more or less a comment on this actual program that we are really grateful for that. And I think it's very important that on such platforms, these are really like well advertised and are conscientized of such platforms for the youth so that they can also be able to contribute. Because some of the challenges we've noticed as youth is we actually can't find the platforms or the opportunities where we can actually give a meaningful contribution. So for us, for instance, with the AY for TJ, we just noticed that it just didn't end there. We just don't want to go for seminars or to attend, you know, all these programs and then to no end. So it's really good to have such platforms so that it's such a continuous kind of discussion, a continuous theme, so that we really begin to engage on a deeper level and we begin to think much broader about some of the issues that have been raised. So I think that's really my contribution. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Chido. I can assure you there's so many warm smiles behind the scenes. Thank you for acknowledging the importance of this kind of platform and especially the issue, right? Youth inclusion and participation. And I'm so glad. I think really we must think about how do we not only just popularize the AUTJP, but how do we popularize platforms that are engaging on youth participation issues regarding the AUTJP? I think that is such a huge, good point that you raise, and something that we do need to think about as a way forward indeed. But thank you. I'm so glad this has been useful. And yeah, I hope we can, that certainly the conversation can continue and we can take, we can continue to advance this agenda of youth, of the TA agenda that is responsive to youth, to their agency, to their capacities, and that really amplifies their voices and their participation. Thank you for that. I'm not sure. I think our colleagues from Africa Reconciled, you were going to speak. And then Mr. John and Omara, I'm not sure if your hands are up from the last time or they're new hands.
Bonjour, merci de la parole accordée. J'ai suivi avec attention le rapport par rapport à la recherche sur la participation des jeunes et j'ai beaucoup plus, ce qui a attiré beaucoup plus mon attention, c'est la plateforme qui a été proposée comme stratégie de pouvoir donner à la femme la place de pouvoir aussi participer à la formulation des propositions par rapport à la justice transitionnelle. Seulement, on ne nous a pas dit comment ça va se passer et j'aimerais avoir ample détail par rapport à cela. Donc, la plateforme qui va encadrer les femmes en vue de pouvoir participer à la proposition des solutions vis-à-vis de la justice transitionnelle. Merci.
Thank you very much to our colleague from Africa Reconciled. I think that's an important question you've asked. Gentil, do you maybe want to read the comments? That would be the last contribution before I allow.
I think it should be challenging. We have so many of them. We have so many of them, but I think most of them have been covered in one way or another by different presentations so far. And I think some of the questions will find answers when participants will have a chance to read the policy brief, both in French and English, depending on the language they are using. So I think since we are running out of time, we're already beyond the time. We can try just to land.
Okay,
thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Gentil. So I think,
thank you so much, Nyari.
No problem. Mr. Ikubaje, I'll allow you then to be the last contributor before I hand over to Anna for concluding remarks and for her to close the meeting.
No, thank you for that excellent facilitation. Let me just quickly, there is a question there asking me how we collaborate with the AU member states. There are different ways through on how we collaborate with member states. Let me just give you one few examples. The transitional justice process in the Gambia, we, in addition, to making sure that we make available the TJ policy, we also, provide training for the committee, the Gambia Transitional Justice Commission. We provided technical assistance by training members of the commission. And the youths, they have a committee and we engage on youth and also look at how we also supported the youth for them to be able to be active more in the work that they do. In addition to that, currently the AU is also working with a foundation called the African Transitional Justice Legacy Fund. They are based in Accra, Ghana, and they only currently work in West African member state. But we are partnering with them, trying to sign an MOU with them to say that they should expand beyond West Africa so that they can also support other member states. They just ended one call for proposals now where they support different organizations, including youth organizations, and they are giving out about 1.6 million to support transitional justice processes. So these are some of the things that we do. We encourage the partners and donors, to support the youth and other stakeholders in TJ. Finally, we are currently we have deployed a youth, to South Sudan Ministry of Justice to support the Truth Commission, but bureaucracy, things take processes and it takes a long time. For us, we want to do that quickly, but we are waiting for responses from their end. And so the plan is to do that in South Sudan and also to do that in the Gambia, where we embedded youth, in the transitional justice mechanism directly. And that youth will be the one to mobilize youth and also look at strategies on how to make sure that the youth are in the center, of implementation of TJ. So these are some of the things that we do. Finally, I just have a request. At the African Union, there are civil society organizations that we call the hit and run. What do I mean by this hit and run? There are some civil society organizations that they are only very good in criticism. And for us, we want to work with organizations that are good, constructive in criticism, and at the same time, coming along to work with us on how to right the wrong. And that is what the CSVR has been doing. We have been working with CSVR and we have made a lot of impact. They hit us when it is necessary to hit us, but at the same time, they come and they work with us for us to achieve a lot. And those are the type of things that we look forward to. And we do hope that Impunity Watch also, we join hands and we team up, with the CSVR, and so that in concrete time, we are able to mobilize, we are able to engage member states and support them to bring about the constructive changes, particularly in ensuring that youth are enmeshed and mainstream into the process of TJ for us to be able to accomplish the type of impact that we are looking for. I thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your very kind words. And thank you also just for sharing the perspective from the African Union perspective on how we can engage more together and to work positively, as a way forward, how we can go forward in a more positive manner, in a more meaningful manner that can actually achieve real results. Thank you so much for your presence here with us today and for your contribution. I just want to take this opportunity now to thank our distinguished panelists, our presenters, Ms. Marlies Staples, and all the participants that are here today, and especially as well those that engaged this very important topic and issue with us. It really was a pleasure to be here with you all today. I also especially want to thank the interpreter who was doing such a fantastic job. Thank you so much for helping all of us to be able to benefit from this platform and not to be excluded. Thank you so much for that. I'm now going to hand over to Ms. Anna Moyo, who is the Executive Director of CSVR. Ms. Moyo is a human rights lawyer with 16 years of experience working in the legal, transitional justice, human rights, and violence prevention fields. So I'm now going to hand over to her to conclude this great forum that we've had today and to close the meeting. I thank you. Anna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nyari. And thank you so much to all our participants for vibrant, robust discussions around youth participation in transitional justice processes at the continental level. And again, thank you again to CSVR and to Impunity Watch for this policy brief with concrete recommendations, policy recommendations on how youth can participate in some of these processes. And I also extend thanks to the African Union for launching in 2021 the African Youth for Transitional Justice, which really concretizes and consolidates what the African Union Transitional Justice Policy started to do in making sure that the voices of the youth are included in the policy, that what is in the policy on the section that speaks about youth and TJ actually is the recommendations, the thoughts, considerations, and perspectives of the youth themselves as they see themselves as leading some of these processes and how they can be included, involved, and how they can continuously participate in some of these processes. without rehashing the presentations and also some of what has been said already, I think just for me, some of the things that really are coming out strongly is that it is important to include the youth. When we're talking about youth participation or youth inclusion, we are not talking about a few youth coming in or being invited to the podium, to these platforms to participate, but we are speaking of an intentional attempt and focus on inviting the youth, going to the ground where the youth are and mobilizing them, speaking to them in their own spaces and gathering their thoughts, gathering their perspectives and including them, hearing from them and pausing to listen to what they are saying. They have a lot to say, as the work that CSVR and Impunity Watch has done has shown, where we reached out to 4 countries and the youth really informed how their participation looks like, what the impediments are in their participation, and what needs to be done going forward to ensure that they are included. What also comes out for me as a key takeaway is that when we leave youth out of some of these processes, then we are creating a leadership vacuum and a participation vacuum. As we constantly say in civil society, the youth are the leaders of the now and of the future. So it means that then the future becomes stranded. The present is also stranded. The current leaders have no successors to take forward some of the some of the robust initiatives that are currently being implemented. So we need the leaders of the now and the leaders of tomorrow to hand over the baton stick of implementing such huge undertakings and agendas like the Africa We Want Agenda 2063, the implementation of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, implementation of a number of initiatives at the African Union level, at a continental level, at regional levels that have been put in place by some of our current leaders and previous leaders. It also has become evident from the presentations that when the youth are left to their devices or when they are not involved in some of these processes, then we open up spaces and opportunities for their radicalization towards violence and conflict. Some of these vacuums make it easy for opportunists such as violent extremist groups and insurgent groups to mobilize the youth and radicalize them towards violence. Then we lose the critical mass of our youth, a demographic dividend on the continent to violence and to conflict, where they become radicalized and they become conscripted into committing some of the atrocities that we are trying to fight as a continent. Therefore, without much further ado, I underscore the importance of including youth, the importance of reaching out to the youth, and thanks to the African Union, because this process has already started. These initiatives are underway. More than 100 youths have been trained in 2021 alone on the African Union Transitional Justice Policy and how they can be engaged. And we have seen from some of those initiatives, the youth taking it upon themselves, taking the baton stick and organizing their own initiatives on transitional justice. In December, I think it was December 2021, we saw the youth who had been trained taking initiative and hosting their own space on the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, mobilizing and educating, raising awareness about the policy to some of the youths in their own constituencies and taking the baton stick forward. These are the kind of initiatives, these are the kind of follow-up processes that we want the youth to be engaged in and take leadership on. On that, I would like to thank everyone for participating with us and joining us in this webinar on launching this policy brief. But we hope that also this launch does not end with the launch that we are hosting today, but that the youth again take on initiative and carry on this successful process by the African Union, by us as CSVR and Impunity Watch, in taking forward some of these lessons and educating some of their youth within their scope of influence, and ensuring that information, awareness, and knowledge of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy and transitional justice and continental instruments on transitional justice at a continental level go as far and wide as possible to other youths who may not be able to participate in some of these spaces, either due to some of the vulnerabilities, some of the lack of access issues, and perhaps geographical challenges and so forth. So really the baton stick has been passed on, and we are really relying on the youth to carry the message far and wide and spread it as well around transitional justice and mobilize on the ground other youths for participation in some of these spaces. We are here for support. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
For your participation. Yeah, Nyari, over to you.
Oh no, thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for being here, staying until the very end. Apologies for going over time, but yeah, this was great. Thank you to our presenters and particularly our panelists